Forvis Mazars is our featured supplier guest today on this Profit Improvement Series webinar event. And the topic is, are you getting the most out of your reinsurance arrangement? And Keith Deans, Executive VP and Chief Operating Officer, is filling in to kick off today's session. He is a familiar face and voice on past webinars we've done in this series. Let's bring on Keith.
Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Strategic Source webinar Profit Improvement Series. Thank you again for joining us. This afternoon, we're pleased to present Robert Davis and Tara Thomas, both partners at Forvis Mazars. Today, they'll provide some insights and expert information on how to get the most out of your reinsurance. And we'll bring them on in just a moment. Right now, we've got a slide up that is basically a QR code. So at the end of the presentation today, you can actually scan this QR code right now and then provide some information to be able to get a copy of that presentation. And then if after you review that, you got some additional questions for Robin and Terry, you'll be able to get that question over to them and be able to get your questions answered. This is actually our third year presenting the Profit Improvement Series. During the course of these webinars, we've been able to present on topics like audit recovery, shipping cost, marketing analysis, dealer management systems, aircraft financing, and even buy-sell dealership webinars. And so our goal is to provide you with opportunities on how you can increase your revenue or reduce your expenses so that ultimately you improve your profitability. If you're new to the series, we encourage you to stay on and for this one as well as other profit improvement webinars that will be coming up in the future. We think you'll find those valuable. But for right now, let's get on and turn it over to Robert and Tara so that they can give you all great information about reinsurance. So take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Keith. We are excited to be here with you guys and look forward to having some good dialogue. Please feel free to put some questions in the chat. We don't have too many slides to cover, but hopefully some good content and then, again, some opportunity to ask some questions and talk through things a little further. So before we get too far into things, we want to just start with a quick polling question so that we understand what our audience is today. So David, I'll let you pull up that poll for us to kick things off. So as Keith mentioned, we're going to be talking about reinsurance today. There is a lot of content, obviously, that we could dive into, but we're going to try to focus on giving you some background information about the different types of reinsurance arrangements that are available. Some of you might be more well-versed in those than others, but then also kind of some key takeaways would be, what are some great questions that you can ask of your administrator to make sure you understand some of the nuances that might not be maybe readily available to you without asking, right? How do you work best with that administrator? And what are some questions you can ask that might provide you the opportunity to have a reinsurance arrangement that's providing more for you? And how do you make sure that that profit is maximized? Of course, that's kind of the whole point of being in this space and involved in these arrangements. We want to make sure that you're getting the most out of it. So just a quick background, Robert and I are both partners in our dealership group at Forvis Mazars. You may not be familiar with the Forvis Mazars name, which is okay. Our firm was formerly DHG, or Dixon Hughes Goodman, which has been very active in the dealership space for many years. We merged with BKD 2 years ago to form Forvis, and then this year created a network with Mazars. It's a mostly international-based firm, and now we are Forvis Mazars. So there's been a number of name changes, but you may know us as DHG. We serve clients both in the automotive space, but also heavy truck, heavy equipment, recreation, power sports. We serve, I think the new count is over 5,000 rooftops across the country, and have team members all over. So this is our area of expertise. I would say reinsurance is maybe Robert's love language. He is very skilled in this, has a lot of background information in it. So again, please, if you have questions after the webinar, things that are maybe a little bit more detailed or nuanced to your arrangement, we'd be happy to help assist you with that going forward. So we'll go ahead and kick things off. Again, this is just kind of our quick agenda. We're going to talk about the different types of arrangements, some specific performance metrics that you should be considering. And then again, the takeaway is, what are those key questions that you should be answering or have answered from your administrator regarding just the operations of your reinsurance arrangements? So one more quick polling question, just so that we have an idea of the types of reinsurance arrangements that those on the call are involved in. So if you could, let us know, what type of reinsurance arrangement does your dealership have? Awesome. So it looks like several retro programs.
Yeah, we've got all types that have come in. We don't see any participants in the NCFC arrangement,
Yeah.
which is the non-controlled foreign corp, typically domiciled in Bermuda. We do have a spike in the none right now, but looking into setting up a participatory arrangement. And when none is there, I assume that you're just in what's known as a walkaway arrangement. You get the gross profit at the store with no further participatory arrangement.
Perfect.
But at any rate, David, if you want to share that with the group.
Great. Well, then hopefully some of this content will be very helpful, especially for those who are looking into setting up a company. So let's jump in. We really have, 4 main reinsurance arrangements that we're going to talk through today. The first being a retro program. We in the accounting space kind of call this mailbox money. Typically, this is essentially just a profit sharing program. There's minimal dealer involvement, no participation cost, but it does allow for sharing of both underwriting profits and investment income. The payments from these types of programs are going to be immediately taxable, but your profit potential is limited. Typically, you do leave some money on the table with this arrangement because you're not participating on any downside risk of poor loss ratios. You also don't have any control over investments here. It's really just straight ordinary income. Most folks who use these programs might use them when you have maybe an ARC arrangement that we'll talk about in a second that's about to fill up, and you need to move some products out of that so you don't hit the premium limitations in the ARC. But it can also be used for just small product volume and for certain products that maybe have a higher risk of those poor loss ratios. So this is kind of your more basic entry level into reinsurance. A lot of folks have them in some capacity, but we'll take it to the next level, which is an ARC, which is an opportunity where you can participate a little bit more in the profits in the reinsurance space. So an ARC, which is an automotive reinsurance company, it's really a CFC, which is a controlled foreign corporation. I promise I'm not going to talk too much tax lingo with you today, but a controlled foreign corporation that has made an election to be treated as a domestic company for U.S. tax purposes. So these entities are going to be domiciled typically offshore, so either Turks and Caicos or Seychelles, but there is a domestic domicile option available to you, which is with the Delaware Tribe of Indians. I was not familiar with the Delaware Tribe before I got involved in reinsurance. They're actually located in Kansas, but they are, there's an opportunity, and we're seeing a lot of people set up ARCs that are now domiciled there, where you can have that, again, domestically located, but still achieve the exact same results that you would if you were located in or domiciled in Turks and Caicos or Seychelles. The key to an ARC is you are limited with this type of arrangement to a $2.8 million annual net written premium cap. So that means you cannot cede premiums in excess of $2.8 million into each individual ARC that you own. So you might be thinking, well, that's easy. If my dealership is large enough that we would have more than the 2.8 million, I'll just set up a whole bunch of extra ARCs, which is possible. However, there are very specific rules that provide for ownership structures. Let me back up. There's attribution rules that provide for ownership structures to be limited. I can't own 10 ARCs where you're ceding premiums into it. But between Robert and I, we could set up 3 between the two of us where I could own 1, he could own 1, and we could own 1 50-50. There are strict ownership rules there, again, trying to make sure people don't take advantage of these caps. But depending on the ownership of your dealership, and if you have enough, as Robert would say, warm bodies to be able to set up these with varying ownership structure, then you can achieve having multiple ARCs and be able to, I guess, overall increase that premium cap that you're allowed each year. These arrangements do provide for full participation in underwriting profit, and the dealer retains control of the program. You do have more control over your investments. So as the reinsurance money starts to have earned reserves, you have a little bit more control over the investments and how those earned reserves are invested. You can also do something called quota share, which means you can take a specific product and you can seed premiums from that product into multiple ARCs. You can kind of split things up again to avoid those caps and basically spread the risk essentially. There's a number of products that can be seeded into an ARC. There's not as many limitations as you'll find in the DOWC. And really the key is that your underwriting income is going to be exempt from federal tax because the ARCs are not domiciled, in a state. Even though Delaware Tribe of Indians, it's here, that domicile is not considered one that would create that federal tax for you. You also don't have any state income tax. When your money is taken out of an ARC and paid back to the owners, it is taxed as a qualified dividend. So you do get a rate arbitrage there because you'd be seeding premiums in, which would provide an ordinary expense to the dealership, but when it's coming back to you, it is a qualified dividend. You are taxable on your investment income in these, but you're skipping the tax on the underwriting income. Robert, did I cover everything there? Anything you want to jump in and add on the ARCs?
No, I think you're good. You've covered it very well.
Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through the other options. So it did look like we had a few folks on the call that do have DOWC models. The key here, maybe one of the key differences between an ARC and a DOWC is that a DOWC is considered an insurance company. So it's not reinsurance, it's insurance. Again, you have the option to have full participation in your underwriting profit. Typically, there's lower administration fees here. Unlike an ARC, your underwriting income is basically deferred, though. It's not excluded from income tax. So essentially the way that this is going to work is that a significant NOL or net operating loss is going to be created on the front end of setting up one of these arrangements. So it is very tax efficient during the time in which you have that NOL, because that NOL is going to wipe out all of your investment income and your underwriting earnings. And typically you'll have a 7 to 9 year period where that NOL is going to continue to be utilized. At the end of that time period, you have to have an exit strategy here. An exit strategy that hopefully will minimize the state and federal income taxes and give you the opportunity to shift over into something new. So I'll skip over just so I don't spend too much time digging into some of these details, but the last arrangement option that I'll give you is an NCFC. I don't think we had anybody in the call that it's involved in those. These arrangements are going to be mostly domiciled in Bermuda. So an NCFC is not a CFC. So essentially a foreign corporation that's not considered a CFC. In these, what you really have to watch out for is that you have to make a protective QEF election because there is PFIC risk, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Bermuda does not have a tax treaty with the U.S., so there's no qualified dividend treatment when your money comes back out. Instead, typically what happens is that you'll generate capital gain by liquidating a series of shares that you would hold in the NCFC. The NCFC is going to be an entity set up where you're going to own just a piece of it, along with many other dealers who have NCFC arrangements. An NCFC itself is not going to be subject to federal tax at the corporate level, but it does have excise taxes and premium taxes. So maybe more than what you needed to know, but wanted to make sure we had that good overview for everybody on the call. Now we're going to shift into reinsurance performance. Robert, I'll kick it to you to talk about some of the important performance metrics that folks need to be considering.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tara. First of all, just to make sure, because I had a speaker problem a little earlier, you can hear me fine.
Yes.
All right. Fantastic. So nonetheless, if we're going to get into one of the arrangements that was out there in the beginning, whether it be a retro or one of the other arrangements that Tara talked about, we need to make sure that it performs. We can have the most tax efficient structure in the world, and if we don't do anything in terms of the underlying performance, either we don't put product in there or we manage claims poorly, then that tax efficiency doesn't do anything for us. So basically, the performance is really a two-part endeavor. The first thing we need to do is to meet or exceed the industry benchmarks for product PVRs. So per vehicle, per vehicle contracting income, the number of contracts or other products that the average customer is buying. In other words, each opportunity might give us 2.3 products that were sold to a customer, or whatever that number is. And you work with your administrator, ask them what their, your contemporaries are doing with them and how well they're performing. And you want to perform, of course, better than average. But overall gross PVR at the dealership is important, and those penetrations are important. So once you're successful at that, now we're seeding sufficient premium into the reinsurance or insurance arrangement. We need to manage the claims process. And that's going to be measured by the loss ratios. And there's really some things that we see recently where loss ratios have been heading in, we'll say, the wrong direction. The gremlins that sort of hurt loss ratios, one of them is the retail warranty rate reimbursement that's so popular that's happening out there in the country right now. And I am not telling you to stop making applications for retail warranty rate reimbursement. Instead, what I want to tell you is when you set the rate card, when you're deciding actuarially how much to put into the reinsurance company, take into account that those costs are going to go up over the life of the contract, and work with your administrator to make sure that they understand what your expectations are for your labor rates and your parts markup rates across the life of the contract, and take that into account when you're deciding how much to seed into the insurance arrangement to cover claims. So the next thing that happens that I have on the slide is competing claims. That's competing dealer claims. That's when a customer takes a vehicle to not your shop, but the shop across town for some reason. Now, you'd like to have a solid plan to minimize that, because that customer goes into that competing shop and they see your warranty product on there, and we all want our service advisors to sell as much as possible. Well, their training kicks into high gear when they find out that you're paying for it rather than them. So nonetheless, make sure you have a solid plan to minimize the competing claims where possible. Obviously, if there is a car that's been sold across country, they're not coming back to your shop. But if it is there, we've got various things that administrators use, it either being disappearing deductibles or mileage tiebacks back to your shop, or perhaps you see a few administrators that when a competing claim is called in for approval, you will get a phone call as the originating dealer and say, hey, do you want to talk with this customer to see if you can get that car back in your shop? They're only 30 miles away. Now, if it's for an alternator, it might not be worth the effort. If it's a major drivetrain claim, you may want to talk to them and say, hey, we'll send a tow truck, or a rollback, we'll pick up that car, we'll get you in a rental car, there's nothing you need to do, so on and so forth, but to get that vehicle back into your shop. So now you want to measure this, okay, with the percentage of claims overall that are with competing dealers, and then what's that average claim size with a competing dealer versus what your average claim size is in your shop. Now, the other thing that happens, you see here, are short claims. Those are claims primarily on used cars that occur within 60 to 90 days after a policy has been issued. We want to investigate each one of those claims to make sure that it was not due to a failure in the reconditioning process. And then if it is a failure in the reconditioning process, you may want to work with your administrator to have those claims become the responsibility of the dealership rather than the reinsurance company, so as to not burden the reinsurance company with a failure on the reconditioning end of things inside the dealership. So those are the things there, Tara. I think that you want to talk about the other bullets that are out here. And before I forget, I do want to add my thank you to StrategicSource for having us today.
Absolutely. Yeah, just really quick on investments. I maybe mentioned a little bit about this when I was going over the types of reinsurance arrangements, but depending on the type of arrangement you have, determines how much control you may have or input you have on the investment. So, if we take a step back, in the retro program, you're not going to have any control over it. In a DOWC, things are going to vary by administrator. I think where you're going to have the most opportunity to have control over those investments is in an ARC. I think everyone wants something a little different from the reinsurance arrangement, right? And I think there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, which is why there are multiple arrangements. And I think the key here is making sure that you have a good understanding of what can be invested and what can't. Can I only invest my earned reserves? Can I do anything with my unearned reserves? Who controls those? How often are we having those conversations? How often are you connecting with the investment advisor related to your reinsurance company? Because we've met with so many clients over the years who have said, I have this money and it's sitting there, but I don't really know what's happening to it. I'm getting these statements every month, but I don't know the nuances. So making sure you understand the investment aspect of this is really important, because sure, these things are going to generate, income for you if they're run properly. However, you can continue to expand on that if you've got investment strategies that work for your desired level of risk and whatnot, and that they're being monitored. So don't forget to ignore the investment side of things after you have focused on the performance metrics to just generate the revenue into the companies, but then also on the back end, the investment side is equally important. And then on structuring, just a quick add here, I mentioned this earlier, but it's very important to pay attention to those attribution rules. Working with your administrator, most of them are very well versed in this and will allow opportunities for you to, discuss how many of these do you need. If you're going with an ARC structure, for example, how much premium are you going to be generating each year, so that you can be very intentional with how you set them up to, again, create a model that's going to work for you, not be too burdensome to maintain, but then also have, tax considerations that can minimize those for you there. So we'll go ahead and keep moving, because I think the rest of the information is really what's most important, and those are those key questions to ask. Before we get there, this is our last polling question. Just out of curiosity, for those that have a reinsurance arrangement, can you tell us a little bit about your reinsurance experience in this poll? Looks like so far we have one person that's very happy with their provider.
Right. We're getting a couple down here on the bottom. We don't know who our reinsurance administrator is. So your reinsurance administrator is the person that you're sending those monthly remittances for the products that are being sold to. Okay? So the cost of the policies that you sell that you're then sending out to someone, and then they're also managing the claims for you. So that may change your answer in case there was just a terminology problem there.
All right, we can go ahead and close that out, and then we'll jump into these questions. We did break up this first section in just, a couple questions that you can ask a specific type of administrator. So if you have a DOWC, I think, again, this is not an exhaustive list of questions, but just a few things that are important to consider. The first one is, what is your solution to apply to the company to minimize income taxes at the state and federal level? Again, when I mentioned earlier, the DOWC is going to turn taxable at some point when that NOL runs out. And so it's really important to understand, what is your exit strategy going to be? What we often see is that, the old DOWC will make an 831B election, and then you will get a new DOWC with maybe new ownership, and then you'll start seeding premiums into that. And I think it's important to note that you do have to have a business reason to create a new DOWC. Maybe you're buying a new store. Maybe you want to separate your risk between cars and trucks or new and used. You want to divide things up. Maybe you want to bring in a new owner, right? There's an employee, a key employee that you want to give a piece of ownership to. Either your risk profile is going to change, or there has to be a business reason to set up a new DOWC. So if you're going this route, just make sure you're having that conversation with your administrator on the front end to know what that planned exit strategy is going to be, and that you're revisiting that, and that you're timely about it, again, in order to maximize the tax benefit of that deferral and make sure you're prepared for when that runs out. And then just another question to consider here is maybe a little of a trick question, but will you quota share ceded premiums into multiple companies? And the issue with DOWCs is that you can't necessarily do this as simply as you could in an ARC, and that's because a DOWC, again, is an insurance company. So that means they are the obligor on the contract. It's not a reinsurance company, it's an insurance company. So a customer is going to contract with your DOWC, so you can't necessarily quota share that because there can only be one obligor on the contract. So not saying that it's completely out of the realm of possibility, but without a special structure, it would be very difficult to do any quota sharing here for your ceded premiums and into multiple companies. Robert, do you want to talk about some NCFC administrator questions?
Sure. On the NCFC side, just briefly, nobody said they were participating in one of these, but on the NCFC side, briefly, you really are pretty much hands-off on the NCFC side of things. Everything is offshore. Now, as a result of this particular arrangement, people have been used to keeping their money in these particular arrangements longer than the other arrangements. However, the Service came back, I think it was like 2017 or 2018, and changed the PFIC rules. That stands for Passive Foreign Investment Company. The new regulations are now, some are final, some are still proposed, but the intent of the regulations is to force the earnings of that company back onshore to make it taxable inside the U.S. when that money is repatriated from Bermuda. Typically that's going to happen 4, 5, 6 years down the road. Depends upon the overall mix of the length of contracts that you put inside the company. The regulations are onerous, and you heard Tara say earlier that all the administrators are suggesting what's known as a protected QEF election. And that's just something that you need to do if you were there to actually reduce, I'll make up a word, the onerousness of the regulations. So there's one that is still proposed. It didn't go final. That might be the most worrisome out there. In its current state, it says that an administrator that outsources all of its underlying insurance activities to independent contractors then causes the NCFC to not be treated as an insurance company. This is a proposed reg. It does not have to be followed by the administrators right now, but if it does final in its current form, and the insurance industry doesn't change how they're doing things, it'd be problematic on how these companies are currently structured. So she also mentioned quite briefly on the how you bring money back into the U.S. on this. You liquidate series of shares unless your administrator has put a parent on top of the Bermudian company in a country that does have a favorable tax treaty. In this case, many companies, if they do it, will do it with the United Kingdom. And then you can use qualified dividends rather than redemptions of shares. So that's the end of that one. You can take retro there, Tara.
Okay. Yeah. This question on retro is kind of getting back to what I mentioned earlier, that the income from a retro is going to be taxable immediately. The one benefit is that at least as long as this provision is still available for tax purposes, the 199A deduction, this income would qualify for that. So you would get that 20% haircut, subject to limitation. You'd group it with your other dealership income, and then that effectively reduces the tax rate on this from 37 down to 29.6. But I think a more important question that's not here, that would be helpful to talk to your retro administrators is, how do you lose your retro money? Because that seems to be maybe a bigger issue. Is, are there certain penetration metrics that you need to be hitting? What are all the ways that you can go into default in your retro agreement and not get the money that you built up there? So I think, Robert, you said, 50 ways to lose your retro money might be a good consideration. Is, am I knowledgeable on all the ways that some of that could be held back? So making sure you understand the program and the ins and outs of it will be crucial to just maximizing that for you. So this last slide is where, we've got another kind of round of questions here. I know there's a lot of text on the screen and maybe some of that's a little small. But Robert, you want to kick us off? We'll just walk through some of these and give you some guidelines of what we would expect the answers to be, or at least some considerations as you have discussions with your administrators.
Sure. Thanks, Tara. So these actually come out of the document that we keep here at Forvis Mazars when we do administrator interviews, and it's a document that has, golly, Tara, I think it's almost 100 questions. I had a dealer one time, we were doing a Zoom interview of an administrator, and he goes, hold on. And he runs off and he comes back. He goes, this is better than a movie. He went and got popcorn out of the showroom floor and sat there and ate it while the administrator and I were talking. I found that to be one of the more jocular moments that happened with this particular document. But we've sort of cherry picked a few questions off of it. And the first one out there is basically, if you want to modify the coverages that you are giving to your customers through the products that you're selling to them through the administrator, can you make those changes? Will the administrator allow you to do that? Or are you just stuck with the standard wording for the state of X, whatever they have through that state administrator that has been approved by that state administrator? It costs them to make a change and turn around, and is that cost passed on to you, separately, or am I just, stuck with whatever that's already out there? I think that's one question. We're going to bounce this back and forth. Tara's going to take the next.
Yeah, the next one's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, are there any minimum product sale requirements? And if not, what are the consequences? Again, kind of looking back at the retro program, where am I going to get docked? Just making sure you understand what requirements you have so that you're not missing out on any opportunities to meet those thresholds and again, keep the program operating as it should.
Many times those consequences can take on the form of a change in the amount of reserves that are held back and called unearned reserves. That if you go into runoff, how is runoff defined? Meaning you're not selling enough product anymore, then suddenly the unearned reserves times 102%, give them a little fluff there, a little safety margin, might go to 110, as an example. The next bullet is, what training and support do you offer my F&I personnel? Now, how often will the administrator be on site to work with your people? What does a visit look like in terms of an agenda? Does it include compliance reviews? We all know how heavily regulated the F&I office is. And then finally, if I decide to take this on myself, if I decide to hire somebody for product support to work with my people, and I assume that payroll, how much would my fee structure decrease because you as the administrator are not responsible for that anymore? So sort of a with and without computation to decide whether you want to do it or you want your administrator to do it. But training and support is essential to, we'll say, proper performance.
And continuing on that theme, there are some administrators who will pay spiffs to F&I employees. I think an important question to know is, A, are they doing that? And B, what do I do if I don't want that to happen? Certainly if somebody's getting money on the side for selling a certain amount of products and they're getting paid directly from the reinsurance administrator, they're going to want to, if you're the dealer, you're going to want to know that, right? You're going to want to know what's influencing them to maybe sell certain products more than others. And what happens if that reinsurance arrangement changes or goes away? Maybe you don't mind, maybe you're okay with that, but understanding what they're paying and how it works is important, because you don't want them influencing your employees in a way that you can't manage, because then it can turn into some HR issues for you. And again, you want to make sure you have a full understanding of that, and making sure that is, again, you just don't want to be left out of that information if it's happening behind your back.
All right. The next one is, how quickly are premiums that are remitted to your reinsurance company or your DOWC? Is it weekly, monthly? Oh my gosh, I hope it's not quarterly, but it can be. We've seen it. Here's the deal. The quicker, the better. As soon as it's seeded, you begin to make money on it, not the administrator. And then, are those premiums moved on an as-written basis or as an as-earned basis? The latter is not attractive in terms of promoting your own income statement on the insurance or reinsurance arrangement. Okay, go ahead.
Moving on from there, how often are those earned reserves being computed, and are they being automatically moved from the custodial accounts to the earned reserves accounts? So I mentioned earlier, from an investment standpoint, there are obviously differences in what you can invest unearned reserves and what you can invest earned reserves in. There's a concept called a B account, which is essentially where that earned reserve money can go to be invested differently, I would say with more risk than your unearned reserves. And so, the purpose of that account is that you get to manage as you desire those investments. And so it's important to know, again, how quickly are those calculations being made, and are they automatically being moved once those reserves are earned, or do you have to request that? Again, depending on what your level of involvement wants to be in the investment side will dictate how you want to manage it, but you need to have open dialogue with your administrator to understand their process for that.
Yeah, and understanding the investment policies for the unearned reserves. These are the reserves that are still being held for claims that will be made by your customers when they have a mechanical breakdown. And so inside those reserves, there's going to be a more restrictive policy because we want to keep those reserves intact, okay, and not have some, we'll say, stock market crash or something that wipes it out type of thing. So what are the policies? How often are they recalculated? And again, what Tara said, how often can I move the earned reserves out of the unearned pool so that if I want to be more aggressive with the investment, I can be, or as I like to say, go place it on the nose of a horse. And so, but that also means I can dividend it. It's suddenly available for loans, typically without restriction, that type thing. All right. So nonetheless, go ahead, Tara.
Yeah, and just maybe one more note on the investment side of things. For those administrators that don't allow the investment advisor or the investments to be chosen by you, what is the historical return for investments for that company for the past several years? I think it's important to understand what that performance looks like. And again, really just gets back to, we've mentioned it several times, how often are you having conversations with those investment advisors to understand once that money is there, how is it working for you?
Yeah, I'd like to see it at least twice a year. You have a meeting that's with the investment advisor, and talk about how am I doing and do we need to shift gears? The next bullet is, can I borrow money from the unearned reserves? These are the reserves that are held in trust for claims still, and your access to those varies widely by administrator. So nonetheless, how much can I delve into the unearned reserves in terms of borrowing? What are the terms of repayment? What is the collateral requirement? And then finally, if I decide to change administrators and I have loans out from unearned reserves, can I keep that loan outstanding as long as I am following the terms of the loan? Or does terminating my business relationship with my former administrator cause those loans to be called by the administrator?
Perfect. And on this last one, we mentioned it already when Robert was discussing competing claims, but it is important to ask, what is the process for helping with competing claims? Is your administrator going to call you when that comes through and give you a chance to say, hey, I'd like to reach out to that customer and see if we could bring that car over here for us to do the work? So just understanding what that process is. Some administrators have better, more formalized processes with that than others. But again, these are just a handful of questions out of a list of many for you to consider, when you're evaluating the performance of your maybe current reinsurance administrator, or deepening that relationship by understanding some of these key nuances. But then also if you're exploring or looking into entering into a reinsurance arrangement, these are some good key questions to ask as you're trying to understand the pros and cons and the differences between administrators. So yeah. I know we kind of rushed through some of that, but Robert, do you have anything else before we open it up for questions?
I do not. I'm interested to see if there are any questions from the audience, and we'll just sit back and let David work through that. I do not see any in the Q&A box right now.
Okay. Thank you, Robert and Tara, and everyone. You can ask questions now via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and those will come straight in, and we'll cover as many as we can with our remaining time. Let's see. I see one. We all know that there is a limit on the amount of premiums that can be put into an ARC without blowing up the structure. Have you ever seen that really be a problem? And when does it happen, and how can it be solved?
I have seen it. and typically people are scrambling for their attorneys when it happens because it so adversely affects the amount of tax that is due to the federal authorities. Typically, it will happen when there is more than one administrator funding one ARC. And because the administrators don't talk to each other, and perhaps they don't know the other exists, they don't know that they're running up on the $2.8 million mark. And it's up to the dealer to make sure that that communication line is open between those two administrators to prevent that from happening. If you catch it quickly, there's typically some ways to undo it, but a lot of times you don't know about it until it's too late, and there's some really adverse tax consequences because suddenly you are subject to tax on the underwriting income and you were not intending to do that.
All right, here is another. In your opinion, how much regular contact should we have with the investment advisor of our reinsurance company?
Kara, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think, Robert, you may have just mentioned, twice a year at least. I think it depends, maybe your own preference, but I would say not, that would be at a minimum. Again, just so that you can make sure, whether it's you monitoring it or somebody on your team, you want to make sure those things are being looked at. And I would say our administrators that we know that are really partnering with dealers, they're doing this. They're having monthly meetings or quarterly meetings. They're reviewing session statements. They're reviewing investment statements. And so, it's not an unreasonable ask. I think some people get complacent with just, things are just chucking along, I don't have to worry about it. But, not having that regular contact, you could really miss out and really leave some money on the table. So I'd say, twice a year at a minimum,
Yep.
but monthly or quarterly is maybe more preferred.
Yeah, we manage some of these monies inside these reinsurance companies, and our folks try to get with the underlying dealerships and dealers, typically more than once a year. Okay, so a question has come in. Okay, I'll read it. It says, what do you recommend for a single owner whose dealerships exceed the premium limit on an ARC and does not want to provide majority ownership to another individual? Do these companies generally switch to a retro or a DOWC plan? So several things here. One, you can strip some product out, perhaps the product that has the worst loss ratios, sometimes tire and wheel, sometimes gap as two examples, and push those over to a retro arrangement. I typically will sit down and make sure that another ARC cannot be formed. That's going to be one thing, just to make sure that another one can't be formed. And then you say in the question, you've sort of answered it yourself, the DOWC plan does not have the $2.8 million limit. And so it's not, at least initially, electing under 831B, okay, to have that limit. So yes, a DOWC plan is also available, but you have to watch your ownership on it as well. Okay, so that's the deal.
Everyone out there, you can go ahead and still ask questions via the Q&A box. Otherwise, let's have Keith activate his webcam and get ready to transition to the next part of the webinar.
Thank you, David. Tara and Robert, thanks again today. What I guess I learned is, the analysis and investment and best practices associated with reinsurance can be pretty darn extensive and complicated. So, I would encourage you, all of you that have attended the webinar, if you happen to see it, to reach out to Robert and Tara to find out how to best navigate this process and how to work with your administrator. Their information is located right there on the screen for you to acquire. And again, if you request a copy of the webinar, you'll have access to that as well to be able to contact both Robert and Tara. Thanks again, guys, for all the valuable information you shared today. Right now, you're able to see actually a QR code, so we encourage you to scan this QR code and to get a copy of it so that you can actually review this webinar again, because a lot of it was packed with information that will help you navigate that process. So again, we look forward to you accessing that webinar. one of the things that we would say that we see with dealers, and again, Robert and Taro are talking about how to maximize that reinsurance process and to protect your profitability. And that's actually one of the things that Strategic Source is looking to do as well for you. And that is, we often see that a lot of our clients are leaving money on the table. And especially in the dealership world, in a lot of instances, they're probably overspending by 25% a month on services and supplies. And so, we want to help you avoid that. Some of the things that we've seen is that in a lot of instances, there's about 150 expense categories. And most dealers will typically have about 100 of those categories that they're spending money in. And to just kind of give you an example, and if you're a $100 million dealership, then you're probably spending about 5% of those revenues in indirect expenses, which means it's about $5 million. We typically see out of that $5 million that we could probably save you 25% or $1.25 million on an annual basis on that. 95% of the dealerships in the U.S. are decentralized, and that means that they probably don't have a purchasing department. And so they are going about this process by themselves. And so that's one of the ways that Strategic Source can partner with you and help you overcome some of those challenges by basically being your outsourced purchasing department. I talked about just a few of the challenges, but here, a few more to kind of consider. 150 categories or 100 categories. There's a lot of them out there. Typically, some of the things that we see is there's not necessarily a plan on how to attack those categories. You may have short staff, especially, when you're trying to sell cars or service those cars. Again, you don't necessarily have someone that's in charge of purchasing. And you don't have some of the data and analytics that help you know what you should be paying for a particular service or supply. And guess what? You don't always work those very often. Well, last year we did about 2,300 sourcing projects, which means we gather a lot of data. And we help to establish what those benchmark pricing should be in those specific areas. I mentioned that dealers are probably overpaying by about 25% for some of those services and supplies. That's because there are a lot of broad categories. There's a lot of suppliers. There are a lot of invoices that are coming through your dealership or through your company that you're going to have to take a look at to really figure out what you're paying. And then in addition to that, are there discounts based on your purchase levels? Are you taking advantage of rebates by maybe on some of those early pay discounts? These are some of the questions that we can help you navigate and we can help you simplify. So you're probably looking at a slide right now that shows you, just different levels of 4 different sizes of companies, ranging anywhere from 25 million to 300 million in annual sales revenue. And this is kind of what it looks like on a monthly basis on what you can potentially be saving. But more importantly, what does that look like to your, as far as the impact to your profitability and the bottom line on a monthly, but more importantly on an annual basis? And again, this is something that we can help you increase by just taking a look at those supplies and expenses. All right, so when we say categories, what does that look like? What does that really include? So let's take a look at some of the probably the most used expenses, no matter what type of company you are. If you're a dealership, a church, a school, or a manufacturing company, there are about 72 general expense categories. And in a lot of instances, this is probably where you're going to be spending some money in these 72 categories. Now, what other categories exist? So facilities. If you own a facility or if you're leasing it, you're gonna be spending money in these 15 related categories. If you happen to be an automobile dealership, guess what? There's another 56 categories that you could be spending money in. So when you add that up, the scope is quite large. There's about 130 to 150 categories that you'll be spending money in, and to try and to track that and understand where you're overspending, who you're spending it with, can just be overwhelming. So there are solutions, and that's again where Strategic Source can kind of come in and help. One of the ways that we help our clients is with our profit improvement program. It's a full service program where we actually go in, we do a financial analysis, take a look at all of your spending with suppliers. We help you kind of create a category spending plan or a work plan on which categories you're going to actually attack. We help provide you with solutions and options and suppliers that will help you do that. And then more importantly, we help you implement those solutions with the suppliers. And then a real critical part is really doing those audits to make sure that what the suppliers agreed upon is actually what you're being charged on a monthly basis. So those audits are very, very important. The other thing that in a lot of instances that we see that our dealers really find value in, and that is the spend analysis. That spend analysis is really a truly detailed breakdown, again, where you're spending your money by category and by supplier, help you put them in the right buckets and help you kind of build a plan on which categories you want to attack and really get the best bang for your buck to drive profitability. And that's kind of what our goal is there. Another area that we see that our dealers get a real benefit from, in a lot of instances, how are you tracking your contracts? Are you able to track when they're going to renew? Is there an auto renewal clause or feature that is associated with that contract? Are you controlling actually the annual percentage increases associated with that contract? And if you don't know the dates of when they renew or when those contracts are going to come up for to be done, then you're going to end up creating some risk, and we want to help you kind of mitigate that risk by tracking your contracts the correct way. All right, so we've talked a little bit about Contract Tracker. We've talked about our profit improvement program, but there are other areas that we can actually assist you with as well. And you know, our spend management suite actually also has some other options for you. And the reason we want to create the suite for you is that, one, we want to overcome some of those challenges that you face. Like we talked about, maybe you've got challenging staffing in your particular dealership or your company. Maybe you don't have contract management, and we want to help you overcome those. But more importantly, we want to help you create those solutions that will help you improve your profitability and again reduce those expenses. So when we take a look at that, one of the online products that we've been able to create, which again some of our clients are really finding valuable, is Expense Edge. And this really is a self-service way for you to go about your purchasing process because it provides you with data again on particular services and products, so that you know what you should be paying and the range for that particular target price for those goods and services. And so you can utilize that basically to help negotiate your own deals with those suppliers and those services. Another area is spend management learning. So maybe you want to kind of build your own purchasing team or your purchasing department. Well, guess what? We'll actually help you do that as well. We'll take you through Purchasing 101, 102, and 103 and actually help get your team up to speed with what are those best practices with regard to negotiation and purchasing, so that, again, you create an effective team at helping to drive costs down at your particular company or dealership. Well, again, I want to just say thanks again to both Tara and Robert. Hopefully you found this presentation today extremely informative and helpful. And again, we've got the QR code up there for you so that you can actually scan that. So that, again, if you want to look at this again, it'll be up on our website in about 24 to 48 hours. And one thing I just want to remind everyone out there that's taking a look, StrategicSource takes no compensation from any of our suppliers. The reason we want to do that is we want to give you an objective opinion about the solutions and suppliers that are going to help you drive those cost savings and ultimately drive profitability at your dealership.
All right. Well, Keith, I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and hopefully it was informative. And I always love to hear about all the things you're doing for dealers as well, and the final part of the presentation there. So thanks for doing that as well.
Our pleasure. So David, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Robert and Tara and Keith. And let's bring up the post-session survey. You spent an hour with us. We want to know what you thought. So let's bring this on. Quick response. It really helps us as we develop these webinars going forward. So thanks everyone for attending, and we look forward to you joining us on future profit improvement webinars with StrategicSource. Have a great rest of the week, everyone, and we look forward to talking with you next month.